Today we'll be finishing this letter to Titus. Seems like we just got started. And it amazes me how there can be so much in such a small letter. It's only 3 chapters of the Bible. Of course, when it was written, it wasn't written in chapters and verses. Letters aren't written like that. But there's so much in there. This morning we'll be looking at several different contrasts. We'll read about things that are excellent, and they're contrasted with things that are worthless. We'll read about things that are profitable for people, and then things that are unprofitable for the church. We'll read about things to engage in, and also the text talks about things to avoid. It speaks of those who are careful to profit people by their good deeds, as the text goes, and then there are those who stir up strife and cause division. So we have these contrasts all in the Word here this morning. He starts out in verse 8 of chapter 3, saying this is a trustworthy statement. A trustworthy statement. We find that little phrase right there only in these pastoral letters, the 2 letters to Timothy and this letter here to Titus today. A trustworthy statement. That means it's a faithful saying for all the ages. It's not some musty, moldy old statement for the first century church. And it's not just a private statement given to Titus and only applying to him. It's a trustworthy statement for all of us, even today. These things apply. And I'm so thankful that the Bible is like that. It applies to us today as much as it did to the men of old and to those whom these letters were written to. For every generation of Christians, it's a trustworthy statement. Verse 8, this is a trustworthy statement, and concerning these things I want you to speak confidently, so that those who have believed God will be careful to engage in good deeds. These things are good and profitable for men. So he tells Titus to preach these things confidently. Be certain of the value of it. If you're certain of the value of something, you can preach it confidently and not be shaky in it, not be reserved in it. If you're certain of the authority behind things, you can preach them confidently. I'm speaking in regard to myself and other pastors. If we're certain of the perpetual nature of it, like I just said, it applies to us today, as well as to those in Titus' day and the first century church. If you're certain of that, then I can preach it to you all. I can say there's something in this sermon today for you guys. And I can preach it confidently because of that. So he tells Titus to speak confidently of these things. Now, as we get into the sermon, we'll see, I'm going to point out under 3 main headings that there are 3 admonitions. Admonitions, is just a fancy word of saying warnings. It's the Bible's way of saying be cautious here. It's an admonition. There are 3 admonitions. And each one of those admonitions is followed by a precept. And a precept is another fancy word of saying a general rule that regulates the warning. So you have a warning and then a general rule that follows. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, we'll see here that he says, be careful to devote yourself to these good deeds. That would be the admonition, that'd be the warning. Here's something to be cautiously, carefully focused on. And then he gives the precept, because these things are good and profitable for men. So you see it, don't you? You see the warning, and then you see the precept. And so as we go through the sermon today, there'll be 3 headings, and I'll divide it that way so it might be a little easier to understand. So in verse 8, I want you to speak confidently so that those who have believed God will be careful to engage in good deeds. These things are good and profitable for men. The first thing I want to hit in passing here is these 2 words tied together, believe God. There's a group of people being spoken of here, and he calls them those who have believed God. Now, I want to make a little distinction here, and I don't want to go off into the weeds on this because it might not be a big one. But he doesn't say in the text right here, those who have believed in God or those who have believed on God. Some versions, the English Standard Version, for example, and maybe the King James Version, do use those words there, believed on or believed in. But in the NAS right here, it's put in just a little bit different way. He says, those who have believed God. And I think what I want to bring out right here at this point is those who have believed God have accepted what he has said as being true. Amen. There's a little bit of a distinction right there. And like I said, I don't fault the translators of the Bible who put believed on God or believed in God, because you don't make it to heaven without that. But what I'm highlighting right here is something that maybe is overlooked, and it's really simple. And it breaks it down in simple terms for people who are struggling with the state of their soul and God and the Bible. And that is, Christianity, when you break it down, is simply believing God, taking him at his word. He has said things in the Bible about you and I, about the state of our soul and our relationship to him. And becoming a Christian is taking God at his word, believing God, the things that he said to be true. He says, those who have believed God. Now that's over and against the other classification of people. And you know, there's only 2 classifications of people right here. Those who have believed God and taken him at his word, and those who have not believed God, and in essence, by not believing him, are calling him a liar. They're not taking him at his word. The Apostle John, you know, in his first letter there, we read it whenever we preached through that first letter, says, whoever does not believe God has made him a liar. He has not received the testimony of God. That's something God has said concerning his Son. So there's that idea of taking God at his word or not taking him at his word, and in essence calling him a liar. So we fit in one or the other of these groups. Which one are you? Either we believe him or we don't. So those who have believed him, they're exhorted here, admonished here, to be careful, to devote themselves to good deeds. Careful. That means full of care. And that's over and against, we use that term, I couldn't care less. So-and-so couldn't care less about this or that. What does that mean? That means their care level is so low, it couldn't get any lower. I couldn't care less. Well, Paul is telling Titus right here, this is one of the confident things you need to preach. You've got a group of people who've believed God, and this is how their lives need to look. In evidence of that, they need to be full of care to engage in good deeds. So what are the good works talked about here? Good deeds, good works. Well, it's a broad term. We tend to think of good works, good deeds, as practical helps, things that benefit other people. If you mow someone's lawn while they're convalescing because of a surgery, is that a good deed? We would say yes, it is. It's practical. It's a practical help. A lot of times, one or the other of us will be sick, or some of the ladies have had babies recently, and the other ladies have got together and organized meals. And they make up a list. This night, so-and-so is going to bring the meal, and this night, so-and-so. What is that? It's a good deed. It's a practical help. It's a good work. Deeds of kindness, deeds of benevolence. Well, what about religious, devotional efforts, things done in obedience to the Bible? Are those good deeds? They are. The Bible says do this, do that, and we obey. It's a good deed. Things done for the glory of God. Some things are done just for the glory of God. Things done out of the love of the Lord Jesus. Have you ever done something or not done something simply out of love for Jesus? That's a good deed. Well, what about the daily small things in your life? When you get up as a believer and you go to work tomorrow morning, many of you have jobs and all. Is that a good deed? Is it a good work? Our job, our occupation, our career, our labors. If we do those things as unto God and not unto men, it's a good deed, isn't it? It's a good work. There are certain attitudes to have. As you get up, you put on your shoes, you get in your car, you go to work, certain attitude that makes that glorifying to God. There's a certain bad attitude that steals the glory from God in the same way. And so our careers, our job occupations, those can be good deeds as well. Now, to the unbeliever, to those who have not believed God, what do we say about good works? We don't say much about good works to that individual in regard to matters of salvation. All we say to the unbeliever is those good works are of no value in terms of salvation, in matters of salvation. You don't make yourself more lovable to God by going to church on Sunday if you don't believe Him. If you're an unbeliever, God doesn't think more highly of you because you might give some money to the church, or you might do this good deed, or you might help that person do something. Those things are worthless in regard to matters of your soul and salvation. I can preach that confidently as well. In fact, I wouldn't be doing you justice if I said otherwise. We read of it in verse 3 of this, or in verse 5 of this very chapter. He saved us not on the basis of deeds which we had done in righteousness. So in regard to good works, that's what we say to the unbeliever. They're worthless as far as your soul is concerned. But yet to the believer, we say, you need to be engaged in these things because they evidence the state of your heart and your soul. They evidence salvation. In regard to salvation, Paul says it's by grace you're saved through faith and not of works, not of your own doing. So if there's any reliance on those external deeds, it's a false hope. We're not saved because we've been baptized or because we take communion or anything like that. We always like to think of ourselves as being self-qualified, you know. We want to, mankind, in fact, that's part of the offense of the gospel. A man wants to think he can do something to elevate himself in God's eyes above the rest of the people and secure his own salvation. He wants to think that. That's because we're all creatures of pride, all of us. But when you come with the gospel and you say the entire world is all on the same level, didn't we read it in the last sermon? For we also once were all of these things. Foolish, disobedient, deceived, and so on and on it goes. But we like to think of ourselves as being qualified. And God and heaven and the favor of God is something we've qualified ourselves for. Like there's a transaction here. I've done these good things and now God owes me in some way. My daughter Angela just sold a car, and there came a point in time where we sat down at the table and signed over the title of the car. Why did we sign the title over to that man? Because he qualified himself by having the amount of money that she agreed to on the price. Qualified himself. But with heaven, it's not that way. There's no stack of good deeds and favors for God that we can do that makes us qualified. In fact, the only way we are qualified is through Jesus Christ. In fact, Colossians 1:12 says, giving thanks to the Father, He has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. But now, as far as Christian living is concerned, good deeds matter. James says, faith by itself, if it doesn't have works, is dead. So I can't show you all of my faith. I can't produce a bucket or a barrel full of it or a handful of it. You can't see it. So the only way that you can know I possess faith is when you see evidence of it. Those that are of the Spirit are like that. The Spirit blows where it wishes, Jesus said in John chapter 3. And you hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it's come from or where it's going. You can't see the wind, but you see the effects of it, the result of it. So these good works are like that. They evidence salvation. As far as Christian living is concerned, James says faith by itself, if it doesn't have works, it's dead. It's just a plain, bare profession. If there's no outward working of God in the life of the believer, what is professed to be a saving faith is nothing but a dead profession. You know, we not only enter the narrow gate, we walk in the narrow way, and that evidences our salvation. By our good deeds, we express our gratitude to God. He's saved us. Now here in this very letter, Titus, we've read up to this point in chapter 2 and verse 14, zealous for good deeds. We read in chapter 3 and verse 1, ready for every good work. And then now here in 3 and verse 8, engage in those good deeds. And in verse 14, at the end of this chapter, good deeds to meet pressing needs. So all of these things are just practical Christianity. It's the outworking of our faith. The practical influence of genuine faith on daily character and behavior in the life of the believer. James did say, be doers of the word, didn't he? And not hearers only. Doers is action. That's an action word. So you can hear the Bible, but then to put effort to it, that's action. That's good deeds. If we just hear and we don't do, what does he say about us there in James 1? He said, we've deceived ourselves. Now that's the worst kind of deception, when you deceive yourself. So faith and works go together. Someone pointed out in a fruit tree, you've got the flower and the fruit. Say you've got an apple tree in your yard. The apple tree blossoms first, you've got a flower. And then after the blossom, then comes the fruit. Well, if we were to use that analogy, faith would be the flower. It comes first. And then fruit comes after the flower, after faith. That would be the good works. We don't want to get those two turned around so that we think the good works earn the faith. In one place, we're told, Paul told Timothy, you're equipped. The man of God is equipped for every good work. In another place, those who had resources, the rich, there were some in the church that had money. And he exhorted them, they're to do good and be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. And then in Hebrews 10:24, we're all exhorted to consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works. Our good works are remembered by God, Hebrews 6:10. God is not so unjust as to overlook your work and the love that you've shown for his name in serving the saints. That's a good work. And they're evidence of our faith, as I said earlier on. You remember in Matthew 25, Jesus was talking about that day of judgment. And he said on that day, there will be two groups of people. One group will be the believers, and he'll tell them to enter into the rest that's been prepared for them. And the reason was, I was sick and you visited me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. All of these things, he gives a list right there. You did those things. And they said, when did we see you like that? Well, he said, you did it to the least of these, some insignificant ones. You did those things to them. And you did it to me in the process. So there's good works, practical Christianity lived out in helping these. And the Lord said that evidenced your faith. They were let into heaven not because they did all of those things and earned heaven. They were let into heaven because they were his children, and it showed itself in the way they lived by doing those things. And that's over and against in Matthew 25 of those who did not do those things, and they complained, when did we see you? And how can we be required to do those things when we didn't see you? And he said, you didn't do it to any of these. So you didn't do it to me. So there's the evidence of faith. So again, the admonition, engage in good works, and the precept, these things are good and profitable for men. Here's another one. Verse 9, we're told to avoid some things. Avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. So the admonition is avoid these things, and he gives the list. The precept is they're unprofitable. They're worthless things to be involved in. Some versions say dissensions and quarrels instead of strife and disputes about the law. So here they are, foolish controversies and genealogies, dissensions and quarrels. Genealogies, they were once useful, in the Old Testament record keeping. That's why we have such long genealogies in certain books. Those Jews, and it's an amazing thing when you think about it, that they could trace their parentage all through their family tree, all the way back to the early tribes, the tribes of Jacob and so on. So Paul was able to say he was from the tribe of Benjamin, as an example. But here in this case, it's a vain pedigree. There were Jews that were saying they could trace themselves back, and they were proud they could trace their family lineage back to so-and-so. So it was a vain pedigree. Paul is telling Titus those genealogies are useless. So they needed to be more involved in fruitful works, like the first admonition, and less involved in these kind of worthless things, foolish controversies and so on. And it's that way, isn't it? There are so many times there are people involved in quarreling over foolish controversies that would do a lot better if they would change their focus to good deeds and being profitable. Because these things produce strife, and so they're wastes of time and worthless. And they don't edify, they just cause division. Foolish controversies. And it seems like there are people who every article of faith and every minute detail of some religious experience, they want to argue that all the time and make a controversy of it, draw their swords out, and they start hacking away. And it's just come to find out as a non-essential item, and all it does is cause dissension and trouble in the church. Wherever there's a fight, a crowd will gather. If there's a fight on a street corner, there'll be a crowd gathered there. And so if you have two people that are professing Christians and they're on the internet or on social media or whatever, and it's a back and forth and things get heated and people on the outside are looking at all of that, it's like the crowd gathering around the fight on the street corner. And what does that do for the cause of Christ in the world? It doesn't do anything, and all it does is cause damage. But there are people, it's like they sharpen their sword, and it's a sword that they plan on using on a brother because of some difference of opinion or in some non-essential item. There are plenty of questions, in the world that just cannot be answered. There are plenty of questions in the Bible that cannot be answered. Paul told Timothy, "Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness." There are things we can't answer, and there are things that good men are on opposite sides of the fence on. So it doesn't profit to turn that into a foolish controversy and divide the church over. A story is told of a man who spent most of his time trying to interpret the mysteries of Revelation and other prophecies. And he said to a friend one day, he said, "I can't quite understand about those 7 trumpets. Can you?" And the man said, "No, but if you'd pay more attention to your 7 children and less to the 7 trumpets, more of your real problems would be solved." So, it's that way a lot of times. We can't answer some of these mysteries, and so we ought not to fight over them. And there are other things that are more profitable. He says these things are good and profitable for men in the previous verse. So avoid. Why? Because it's unprofitable and worthless. Then here's a third one. It says in verse 10, reject a factious man. or a divisive man, some versions might read, or a heretic, other versions might read. Reject a factious man after a first and a second warning. That's the admonition. What's the precept? Knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. If your version uses the word heretic, a lot of times we think of a heretic as someone who's preaching something heretical that is different than the orthodox view of the church. Back in the older days, they used to burn heretics, as you might call them, if you called them that. They used to burn them at the stake and torture them. The Inquisition was the Catholics' version of trying to root out heretics. And when they found one, they would torture someone trying to get them to recant whatever they thought was heretical against Catholic doctrine. But the word really means, in this context right here, not just someone who's preaching something against the orthodoxy of the church, but it means someone who's divisive, schismatic, causing division in the church. That's why the word divisive is used in some versions. In the New American, it's factious, creating a faction. I think in the ESV, it's divisive, reject a divisive man. Albert Barnes, one of the guys that I read when I'm studying, he says the man who makes divisions in a church, instead of aiming to promote unity, not merely one who holds a different doctrine from that which is regarded as orthodoxy, is the heretic. The essential idea is that of a factious, division-making man, someone who splits rather than unifies. In the analogy of the sheep and the herd of the flock of sheep, it's dividing the flock and sending them being scattered rather than bringing them together. The tendency of the contentious spirit is to dwell on the minute and the trifling and exalt them to undue importance. How often we've seen that. Something small made into something big, and in the end, division. He is the heretic who disseminates his private opinions with the result of raising dissension. Another man that I read, his name is Wagstaff. You may or may not have heard of him, but it was very helpful what he had to say. He said, a heretic is a man of a stubborn, inflexible, unyielding spirit. He's self-willed and contending for his own theories. As such, a man must be faithfully warned more than once, and if he refuses to be advised and continues having a stubborn, uncooperative attitude toward authority, leave him to himself, have nothing more to do with him. We cannot help a man who refuses to be controlled by anything but his own wild, ungovernable temper. That's what Wagstaff had said. But we do know here that Paul is saying they're persistent in it. 2 warnings, he says. And the apostle doesn't say that the way in which this admonition is to be given, whether it's supposed to be public or private, he doesn't say that right here. It seems like the language, I'm told, in the original language would support either. And the method which is to be adopted is doubtless to be determined by the circumstances of the situation, whether it's public or private. But he says, give them 2 warnings. The individual 2 warnings, and then reject is the word here. Turn away from, avoid, exclude. And it's really similar to what Paul said in Romans 16 and verse 17. I urge you, brethren, keep your eye on those who cause dissensions and hindrances, contrary to the teaching which you've learned, and turn away from them. So I'll quote Barnes one more time here, and then that'll be all. But Barnes says, he's to be admonished more than once by those who have the right to admonish him. And then only, if he does not repent, he's to be simply avoided. That is to be the end of the matter so far as we're concerned. The power of the church there ceases. It has no power to deliver him over to anyone else for persecution or punishment. We don't burn people at the stake here, out back or something like that, or in any way to meddle with him. He may live where he pleases, pursue his own plans, entertain his own opinions or company, provided he does not interfere with us. And though we have a right to examine his opinions, which he may entertain, yet our work with him is done. That's what Barnes interprets reject to mean. And he says, the Apostle Paul says, verse 11, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. So we're convinced there's a conviction here in regard to him. And one of the things we're convinced is that what he's doing is wrong. He's sinning. And not only that, but he himself is twisted. The word is perverted here. And it really means he's subverting. It's a twist. Subverting is undermining the authority, destabilizing something that's established. That's how you subvert something. You dig under it until that which was established has been undermined. That's subverting. So that's what this individual is like. He's sinning, he's undermining, and he's self-condemned. That self-condemned means his own blameworthy actions are his guilt. And the reaction to his behavior by those that are in authority is his own fault and not theirs. The sin is his own. So the heretics were self-condemned by the very fact that they continued to create division after repeated warnings. Verse 12, when I send Artemas, here are just some final instructions and closing words. He says, when I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, make every effort to come to me at Nicopolis, for I've decided to spend the winter there, and diligently help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way so that nothing is lacking for them. Here are two good works actually in operation. Now that we mention it, he's been talking about good works. Here are a couple of them. Here are two willing travelers that Paul sent to Titus so that he could make efforts, Titus could make efforts to link up with Paul in Nicopolis before the winter to try and minister to him. So it's good works on the part of these two individuals. Wouldn't you say, Artemas and Tychicus? Here they are traveling to relieve Titus so he can go be with Paul and minister to him, hopefully before winter gets there. So that's a couple of good works for these fellows. We don't know anything about Artemas. Tychicus we know about because Paul said he's a beloved brother and a faithful minister. So we know a little bit about his good behavior and his usefulness and his character there. And then here's this guy, Zenas, the lawyer. Apparently he was someone schooled in Roman law, and all that tells me is the gospel is not just for poor people, uneducated people, gullible people. Here's man Zenas the lawyer. He was a man of intellect, apparently, and the gospel saved him. So God does save intellectuals. He can save intellectuals. And then Apollos is spoken of, and we know him from Acts 18. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures, instructed in the way of the Lord. And the word to Titus concerning them was send them fully supplied on their way. Now, that's another good work, isn't it? Here was Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos. Two guys that are leaving. The other two guys are due to arrive. So here are these two guys that are leaving, and the word to Titus is, send them on their way fully supplied. Don't let them leave lacking anything. So that's a good work, to supply the saints. In fact, John said in his third letter, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers even as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You'll do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they've gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. You're a worker with someone if you support them financially in their efforts. You and I, we don't have the calling or the means to go to Lebanon, but we might have the means to support Dan Sem, who's working in Lebanon, and be a fellow laborer with him in the cause. That's a good work. And we've had some come and minister to us, from time to time, filling the pulpit and preaching to us, men from far away. And it's the desire of myself and the church, you as well, to, before they leave, send them on their way fully supplied. Support them in their efforts. Be fellow workers for the truth with them. Verse 14, our people must also learn to engage in good deeds, to meet pressing needs so that they'll not be unfruitful. More final words he gives them in regard to good deeds. And what comes to my mind is these are things that we learn to be engaged in. That tells me there's growth there. I can learn better how to sniff out a pressing need and be a contributor to it and help. So are we growing in this area would be my question. That would be the pointed question for you and I. Are we growing in this area of finding out urgent needs and helping? Are we fruitful in this area? That's the term he uses there, so that they will not be unfruitful, but fruitful in this area of helping out in urgent needs. There are some needs that are urgent. There are people in very difficult, pressing circumstances that need help. Here's an area how we can help. And then he gives these final greetings. All who are with me greet you. Greet those who love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. Over and over again, this apostle, when he writes these letters, he finishes with words, greet one another. Just like here, greet those who love us in the faith. And it's the importance placed on warm greetings toward one another. This pandemic, it came, and lo and behold, it's rare to shake someone's hand. You almost have to apologize. Like, I'm willing to shake anybody's hand. It doesn't bother me, but some are very reserved about that, and rightfully so in this day and age. But we still ought to be able to give a warm greeting, and how much more rare it is to see someone hug another person nowadays because of this pandemic. But it didn't used to be like that here, did it? There were plenty of hugs and plenty of handshakes, and I miss the days. There's a lot that's said in a warm, firm handshake. It's a warm greeting. Greet one another, he says. And it puts importance on that. It's the strength of Christian fellowship. And here he gives Christian well wishes. A lot of times, grace be with you all. In his letters, he gives these Christian well wishes. And he had widely scattered friends in the church. This letter went to Titus. And back in those days, it's not like today. Today you can type a message out, send it, and someone all the way on the other side of the world gets it instantly. But back in those days, a letter was written and it was taken by someone to someone else and transported along until it finally arrived at the church here to Titus at the church. And lo and behold, it contains greetings at the end from the apostle to his widely scattered Christian friends, because God has got his people everywhere. And we're all tied together in the family of God. And so here are these heartfelt well wishes. Chapter 16 of Romans is filled practically to the brim with these greetings to various individuals. Greet so-and-so in the faith. Greet so-and-so, and they helped me. And he not only gives them these well wishes, but it's filled also with acknowledgments of what people have done. So here's their love. He wishes love, faith, grace. Those things are all included in this verse right here. Were it not for the works of God in our hearts, think about this. How many of our paths would never have crossed? I never would have known some of you if it weren't for this thread that's knit our hearts together of faith, love, and grace in God and what he's done for us. All my Christian friends, all my true friends are Christians, Christian friends. Everyone else is some varying level of an acquaintance. And I felt that way when I was working construction as an electrician. I'd go to work and I might have a friend or two on the job or something, but they were mostly acquaintances. And in my past life, I had things I was involved in the world, race cars and all of that, and I had a little core of people around me that had the same interests. But when God took those interests away, the friends disappeared, or those acquaintances disappeared. It's the people of God that are your true friends. Scattered though they may be, we've had some in recent days over the holidays from our sister church in San Antonio and different ones representing other churches here. But if there are Christian brethren, it doesn't matter if they're 900 miles away. When we see them, we greet them in the Lord. And we agree with the apostle here. Greet those who love us in the faith. I'm very thankful. The Lord Jesus told his disciples in John 13, "By this all people will know that you're my disciples." Why? Because they can express their doctrine so clearly? No, it's because you have love for one another. So that's what we highlight here, as the apostle does in the closing of this letter. Well, that's all for today. Speak confidently of these things, he says.